Welcome back to History Unlocked. I'm Mr MacAulay, and today we're going to be diving into the spiritual heart of ancient Egypt, a world where gods walked among mortals, where death was just the beginning of an epic adventure, and where the boundary between the sacred and the everyday life didn't exist. If you've been following this series on ancient Egypt, you know that we've covered geography, politics, monuments, daily life, and the intellectual achievements of those ancient Egyptians. But here's the thing. You can't really understand any of those topics without understanding the ancient Egyptian religion, because religion wasn't just one part of their life. It was ancient Egyptian life. Every single thing the ancient Egyptians did, from farming to governing to building pyramids and raising children, was infused with religious meaning. They lived in a world where gods controlled the weather, where saying the right prayer could literally save your life, and where preparing for death was just as important as preparing for tomorrow's breakfast. Today we're going to meet the Egyptian gods, and trust me, this pantheon makes Marvel superheroes look simple. We're talking about deities who could take multiple forms, combine with each other, and appear as animals, humans, or bizarre combinations of both. We'll explore rituals that lasted for days, temples that were like ancient spiritual cities, and beliefs about the afterlife that were so detailed they came with instruction manuals. But most importantly, we're going to understand how these beliefs shaped one of history's most successful civilizations and continue to fascinate us thousands of years later. So let's start with something that often confuses people about Egyptian religion. Just how many gods were there? Well, we're not talking about a simple pantheon like 12 Olympians of Greek mythology. Egyptian religion included hundreds or maybe thousands of deities, ranging from cosmic powers who controlled the universe, down to local gods who protected individual villages. But here's what's really mind-bending about Egyptian gods. They weren't fixed, unchanging entities like gods in most other religions. Egyptian deities were fluid and dynamic beings who could merge with each other, take different forms, and even change their fundamental nature over time. Let's take Ra, the sun god, who was absolutely central to Egyptian religion. But Ra wasn't just one god. He was Ra in the morning, he was Ra Harakti in noon, and Atum Ra in the evening. He could combine with other gods to become Ra Amun, or Amun Ra. He appeared as a falcon, a man with a falcon head, a scarab beetle, or pure solar energy. One god, yet dozens of manifestations. This flexibility wasn't confusing to the Egyptians, however. It was a much more sophisticated theology. They understood that divine power was far too complex to be contained in any single form or personality. Their gods were like different facets of cosmic forces that were far too vast for human comprehension. The Egyptians organized their gods into several categories. There were the creator gods who brought the universe into existence, the cosmic gods who maintained order of reality, state gods who protected Egypt as a nation, and local gods who watched over specific cities or regions. And then we have the household gods, who helped with people's daily problems. But even that organization was fluid. A local god could become a national deity if their city became politically important. A household god could be promoted to cosmic status if their popularity grew. The Egyptian pantheon was more like a divine social media platform where gods could gain or lose followers. They could win influence over time. But the Egyptian religion was built around one of the most sophisticated creation myths ever developed. This wasn't just a simple, and then God created the world story. It was a much more complex cosmic drama involving multiple generations of gods, primordial forces, and ongoing battles between order and chaos. In the beginning, according to Egyptian belief, there was only none, the primordial waters of chaos. Nothing existed except this infinite dark ocean of potential. Then, through an act of pure will, the first god, Atum, brought himself into existence. From Atum came Shu, and then Tefnut, who produced Geb and Nut. Geb and Nut had 4 children, Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. This family of 9 gods, the Ennead, formed the basic structure of Egyptian cosmology. But this isn't just ancient mythology. It's a sophisticated philosophy about the nature of existence. The Egyptians understood that order, called Ma'at, was constantly threatened by chaos, called Isfet. The universe wasn't a finished, perfect creation. It was an ongoing battle between constructive and destructive forces. Every day the sun god Ra had to travel through the underworld and defeat the chaos serpent Apep to ensure that the sun would rise again. Every year the Nile had to flood at the right time to maintain fertility and life. Every moment the forces of order had to work to prevent reality from sliding back into primordial chaos. This cosmic drama wasn't just theological speculation. It explained everything about Egyptian life. Why did bad things happen? Well, because chaos was always trying to break through. Why were rituals necessary? Because they helped maintain cosmic order. Why was the pharaoh divine? Because he was the chief agent of Ma'at on Earth. Alright, so before we get too far into this, I need to introduce you to some of the key figures in the Egyptian pantheon. Because these gods were like celebrities of ancient Egypt. Everyone knew their stories, their personalities, and their relationships. First, we've got Ra. He's the ultimate power. The sun god whose daily journey across the sky brought life and light to Egypt. But Ra wasn't just a distant cosmic force. He was also the divine pharaoh of the gods, ruling from his solar back and making decisions that affected both divine and human realms. Ra was portrayed as a falcon-headed man wearing a sun disk, but like we've mentioned before, he might also sometimes appear as a scarab beetle, a ram, or a phoenix. Then we've got Osiris, and he's perhaps the most beloved god in the entire pantheon. Originally a king of Egypt, Osiris was murdered by his jealous brother Seth, cut into pieces and scattered across the land. But his wife Isis gathered the pieces, reassembled his body, and brought him back to life through powerful magic. Osiris then became king of the underworld and judge of the dead. The Osiris myth is incredibly powerful because it promised that death wasn't the end, and that through proper rituals and moral behavior, everyone could achieve resurrection and eternal life, just like Osiris. This wasn't just a story about gods, but it was a promise about human potential. So we mentioned Isis, and she's the ultimate divine mother and magician. She was shown as a woman with throne-shaped hieroglyphs on her head, often nursing her son Horus. Isis represented maternal love, magical power, and feminine wisdom. She was so popular that her worship spread throughout the Roman Empire, and it influenced early Christianity. Horus appeared in multiple forms, but was the most famous as the falcon god, and the divine prototype for living pharaohs. Every pharaoh was considered the living embodiment of Horus himself, which is why royal names were written inside falcon-topped cartouches. Horus represented divine kingship, protection, and the triumph of order over chaos. And here we have Thoth. He was the god of wisdom, writing, and judgment, portrayed as an ibis-headed man or a baboon. Thoth invented hieroglyphs, maintained the universe's mathematical order, and recorded the deeds of the dead. He was basically the divine patron of scribes, scientists, and scholars. Hathor was one of the most complex goddesses, appearing as a cow, a woman with cow ears, or a woman with a sun disk between cow horns. She was simultaneously the goddess of love, music, dancing, fertility, and destruction. Hathor could be nurturing or terrifying, creative or destructive, representing the full complexity of feminine divine power. Finally, we have Anubis, and he was the jackal-headed god who guided souls through the afterlife and supervised mummification. He was particularly important because he protected the dead during their vulnerable journey to the afterlife and ensured that burial rituals were performed correctly. So in ancient Egyptian religion, we need to talk about the pharaoh, because we know the pharaohs as a political ruler, the king of the entirety of Egypt. But they weren't just political rulers. They were the living bridge between the human and the divine worlds. This role was so central to Egyptian civilization that understanding it is key to understanding everything else about Egyptian culture. The pharaoh was considered the earthly incarnation of Horus and the son of Ra. But this wasn't just symbolic. Egyptians genuinely believed their king was a god walking among them. This divine nature gave the pharaoh unique responsibilities and power that no ordinary human could possess. Every morning, the pharaoh was supposed to perform the daily temple ritual at temples throughout Egypt. Obviously, he couldn't personally be at every temple, so priests would act as his representatives. But the ritual prayers and offerings were always made in the pharaoh's names because only a god could properly communicate with the other gods. The pharaoh was also responsible for maintaining Ma'at, cosmic order and justice. This meant more than just making good laws. The pharaoh had to ensure that the Nile flooded properly, that Egypt remained prosperous, that enemies were defeated, and that the gods remained favourable to Egypt. If anything went wrong, it was seen as a sign that the pharaoh had failed in his divine duties. This divine kingship system was incredibly effective for maintaining political stability. Rebelling against the pharaoh wasn't just treason, but it was blasphemy that threatened the cosmic order. Supporting the pharaoh wasn't just patriotism, but it was religious duty that helped maintain the universe itself. So I mentioned the temples, and it's important that we understand that Egyptian temples weren't like modern churches where people gathered for weekly services, but these were elaborate divine palaces where gods literally lived on earth, complete with daily routines, meals, clothing changes, and entertainment. The largest temples were much like small cities. The Karnak temple covered over 200 acres and employed thousands of priests, craftsmen, farmers, and administrators. It had its own workshops, granaries, libraries, schools, and even medical facilities. The temple owned vast agricultural estates and controlled significant portions of Egypt's wealth. But even understanding the scale doesn't capture what made these temples so special. Egyptians believed that the god actually resided in the temple's inner sanctuary, usually in the form of a sacred statue. This wasn't just a symbol of the god, this was literally the god, magically animated and spiritually present. The temple's daily routine revolved around caring for this divine resident. Every morning, priests would wake up the god by opening the sanctuary doors. They would wash and dress the statue, offer food and drink, and perform prayers and hymns. At noon, they'd provide lunch and entertainment. In the evening, they'd perform closing rituals and put the god to bed. This might sound silly to our modern ears, but it was still very sophisticated theology for the time. Egyptians understood that divine beings needed to be properly honoured and cared for if they were going to continue blessing Egypt with their protection and favour. The temple architecture itself was designed to recreate the cosmos in miniature. The entrance pylons represented the mountains on the horizon, the halls represented the earth, and the sanctuary represented the primordial mound where creation began. Walking through a temple was like taking a spiritual journey from the mundane world to the divine realm. So the Egyptian priests, they weren't really like modern clergy who counsel individuals and lead congregational worship. These were more like specialized professionals who maintained the complex machinery of divine service. Kind of like a combination of chefs, costume designers, accountants, and stage managers for the gods. There were many different types of priests with very specific functions. There were servants, regular priests who performed daily rituals. There were Keriheb, lector priests who recited the proper prayers and spells. There were Wab priests, who handled purification rituals, and Sem priests wore leopard skins and performed special ceremonies. But not all religious professionals were full-time priests. Many served on a rotating basis, working in the temple for 1 month out of every 4, and then returning to their regular jobs as farmers, craftsmen, or administrators. This system meant that religious knowledge was widely distributed throughout Egyptian society. Priests had to maintain ritual purity through complex purification practices. They shaved their entire bodies daily, bathed in sacred pools, wore only linen clothing, and avoided certain foods. They couldn't eat fish, pork, or beans, and had to abstain from sexual activity during their service periods. High priests were among the most powerful people in Egypt, controlling vast temple wealth and wielding enormous political influence. The high priest of Amun at Thebes was sometimes more powerful than the government officials, and during some periods, high priests actually ruled parts of Egypt as independent kings. Now, while ordinary Egyptians couldn't enter the inner sanctuaries of temples, they participated in religion through spectacular public festivals that brought entire communities together through celebration and worship. The most important was the Opet festival, when the statue of Amun travelled from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple in a massive processional boat carried by dozens of priests. The entire city of Thebes would turn out for this event, which lasted for weeks, and it included music, dancing, feasting, and general celebration. During festivals, the gods would speak to the people through oracular consultations. Priests carrying the god's sacred bark would ask yes or no questions, and the god would answer by making the carriers move forwards or backwards. People could ask about everything from business decisions to marriage choices to legal disputes. These festivals weren't just religious events, they were economic and social celebrations that reinforced community bonds and provided entertainment for people whose daily lives were often difficult and maybe monotonous. They were ancient Egypt's equivalent of state fairs, religious revivals, rock concerts, all rolled into one. Now, some festivals would have specific purposes. The Sed festival celebrated the pharaoh's continued vitality and renewed his divine power. The beautiful festival of the valley honoured the dead and strengthened connections between the living and their ancestors. The festival of drunkenness celebrated Hathor and involved exactly what you'd expect from the name. But no aspect of Egyptian religion is more famous than their elaborate beliefs about death and the afterlife. The Egyptian afterlife beliefs weren't just about what happened after you died. They were there to shape people's entire lives. Egyptians believed that humans had multiple souls or spiritual elements. The Ka was your life force or your spiritual double. The Ba was your personality or individual essence. And the Ak was what you could become if you successfully navigated the afterlife, a glorified divine being. But possessing these spiritual elements wasn't enough to guarantee a good afterlife. You had to earn eternal life through moral behavior during your lifetime and proper preparation for death. The journey to the afterlife was like the world's most dangerous obstacle course. First, your body had to be properly mummified to preserve it for all eternity. Then your soul had to navigate the treacherous underworld, avoiding demons, monsters, and various traps designed to destroy the unprepared. The climax came in the Hall of Two Truths, where your heart, considered the seat of intelligence and morality, was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, which is truth and justice. If your heart was lighter than the feather, meaning you had lived a moral life, you would be admitted to paradise. But if your heart was heavier, meaning you were weighed down by sin, you would be devoured by Amit, a monster that was part crocodile, part lion, and part hippopotamus. But even this wasn't the end. Successful souls had to recite complex spells, answer riddles from various gods, and demonstrate their knowledge of divine names and sacred geography. The Book of the Dead was essentially a study guide for this final exam. Those who passed all the tests would join Osiris in the Field of Reeds, a paradise that was like an idealized version of Egypt, where the grain grew extra tall, the weather was always perfect, and everyone lived in harmony forever. Egyptian religion wasn't just about grand temples and cosmic dramas. It was deeply embedded in daily life through magical practices that modern people might recognize as folk religion or spiritual self-help. Egyptians wore amulets for protection, placed magical texts in their homes, and performed rituals for everything from ensuring safe childbirth to protecting crops from locusts. They believed that knowing the right spells and performing the correct actions could literally change reality. Heka wasn't considered separate from religion. That's magic, by the way. It was religion at the personal level. Heka, or magic, was the divine force that gods used to create and maintain the universe, and humans could tap into this same power through proper knowledge and ritual practice. Popular household gods included Bes, a dwarf deity who protected children and women in childbirth, and Taweret, a hippo goddess who helped with fertility and pregnancy. These gods didn't live in grand temples. They lived in people's homes and were consulted about everyday problems. Egyptians also practiced ancestor veneration, believing that deceased family members could help or harm the living. They would leave offerings at family tombs, write letters to dead relatives asking for help, and perform rituals to maintain good relationships with their ancestors. Dream interpretation was also taken very seriously. Egyptians believed that dreams were messages from the gods or visits from the deceased. They had professional dream interpreters and detailed manuals for understanding dream symbolism. But Egyptian religion wasn't just static for the civilization's 3,000-year history. It evolved and it changed and it adapted to new circumstances while maintaining its core beliefs and practices. During the Old Kingdom, the solar religion centered on Ra was dominant. The pharaoh was primarily seen as the son of Ra, and pyramid texts focused on the king's journey to join the sun god in the heavens. But in the Middle Kingdom, Osiris became increasingly important as Egyptian religion became more democratic. The afterlife wasn't just for pharaohs anymore. Ordinary people could also achieve resurrection and eternal life through proper preparation and moral behavior. The New Kingdom saw the rise of Amun-Ra as the supreme deity and the development of a more complex theological system. This period also witnessed the brief religious revolution of Akhenaten, who attempted to replace traditional Egyptian polytheism with worship of a single god, Aten. During the wait period, Egyptian religion became increasingly focused on animal worship and elaborate mummification practices. Sacred animals like the Apis bull and cats became important religious figures, and animal mummies were produced by the millions. One of the most fascinating episodes in Egyptian religious history was the reign of Akhenaten, originally Amenhotep IV, who around 1350 BCE attempted to completely revolutionize Egyptian religion by promoting the worship of a single god, Aten. Akhenaten didn't just change Egyptian religion, he also moved the capital city, he altered artistic styles, and tried to erase the names of more traditional gods from monuments throughout Egypt. He declared that Aten was the only true god, and that he, Akhenaten, was Aten's sole representative on earth. This wasn't just religious reform. It was a complete social revolution. Akhenaten closed traditional temples. He fired thousands of priests and redirected temple wealth to support his new religion. He built a new capital city, Akhenaten, modern Amarna, designed around Aten worship. Akhenaten's religion was remarkably sophisticated, emphasizing the sun's life-giving power and promoting a more naturalistic art style. His famous hymn to Aten contains passages that are remarkably similar to Psalm 104 in the Hebrew Bible. But the revolution didn't survive Akhenaten's death. His successors, including the famous Tutankhamun, restored traditional religion and tried to erase all traces of the Amarna period. The experiment in monotheism was abandoned, and Egypt returned to its traditional polytheistic beliefs. Some scholars argue that Akhenaten's monotheism influenced later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, though this remains controversial. But what's clear is this episode demonstrates both the power of religious tradition and the potential for radical religious innovation in ancient Egypt. So Egyptian religion, it wasn't all just rituals and afterlife beliefs. It included a very sophisticated moral and ethical teachings that influenced behavior in daily life. The concept of Ma'at was central to Egyptian ethics. Ma'at represented truth, justice, order, harmony, law, morality, and balance. Living according to Ma'at wasn't just about following the rules, but it was about maintaining cosmic harmony through personal behavior. Egyptian wisdom literature included detailed moral instructions. The instructions of Ptahhotep taught, "Be skilled in speech, then you will succeed. The tongue of a man is his rudder." The instructions of Amenhotep included teachings like, "Do not move the markers on the borders of fields," and "Do not laugh at a blind man or tease a dwarf." These weren't arbitrary commandments. These were very practical wisdom for living in a complex society. Egyptian moral teachings emphasized honesty in business, kindness to the poor, respect for your elders, the responsibility for family and community. The negative confession in the Book of the Dead listed 42 sins that the deceased had to deny committing, including things like murder, theft, adultery, fraud, cruelty to animals, and environmental destruction. This wasn't just afterlife preparation, it was a comprehensive ethical code for daily behaviour. Egyptian religion taught that moral behaviour was rewarded in both this life and the next. Good people would prosper, live long lives, and achieve a blessed afterlife, whereas evil people would suffer in this world and they would be destroyed in the next. When we're looking at Egyptian religious art, we need to understand that it wasn't just decorative. It was functional magic designed to make divine power present and accessible in the human world. Temple reliefs weren't just pretty pictures, they were visual spells that made the depicted actions magically real. When wall paintings showed the pharaoh making offerings to the gods, the magic of these images meant that these offerings were continuously presented for eternity. Religious symbols also carried deep meaning that was understood by all Egyptians. The Ankh representing life, the Djed symbolized stability, the Waz scepter meant power, the Tayet provided magical protection. These weren't just decorative motifs, they were very functional magical tools. Colours also had religious significance. Gold represented the flesh of the gods, blue symbolized the heavens, green was rebirth and vegetation. Red could represent either life or danger, and black signified fertility and rebirth. Even artistic proportions were religiously determined. Egyptian artists used mathematical grids to ensure that divine figures were depicted with perfect proportions, which reflected cosmic harmony. This wasn't just artistic convention, but it was a theological requirement. Egyptian religion was also incredibly persistent, maintaining its core beliefs and practices for over 3,000 years, despite political upheavals, foreign invasions, and social changes. Even when the Egyptians were conquered by the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, Egyptian religious traditions continued. Foreign rulers often adopted Egyptian religious practices and presented themselves as traditional pharaohs to gain legitimacy with the Egyptian subjects. Egyptian religious ideas influenced other cultures throughout the ancient world too. Isis worship spread throughout the Roman Empire. Egyptian magical practices influenced Greek mystery religions. Egyptian afterlife beliefs may have influenced Jewish, Christian, and Islamic concepts of heaven and judgment. Some Egyptian religious practices continued even after the rise of Christianity. The last hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE, and the last temple of Isis wasn't closed until 550 CE, over 500 years after Christianity became the Roman Empire's official religion. Alright, so what can we really learn from the ancient Egyptian religion? Well, first of all, that religious beliefs aren't just private matters. They shape entire civilizations by providing shared values, common goals, and social cohesion. Egyptian religion demonstrated that humans need meaning and purpose beyond material survival. The elaborate preparation for the afterlife, the complex rituals, and the sophisticated theology all show people seeking to understand their place in the cosmos and their relationship to ultimate reality. The Egyptian emphasis on Ma'at shows that successful societies require shared moral values and ethical behavior. The connection between religious belief and social responsibility created a stable civilization that lasted for millennia. Egyptian religion also shows the power of hope and the human refusal to accept death as final. The promise of resurrection and eternal life gave meaning to suffering and motivation for moral behavior. But the ancient Egyptian religion continues to fascinate us to this day because it addressed fundamental human questions that remain relevant. What happens after we die? How should we live? What is our relationship to the divine? How do we find meaning in existence? The Egyptian answers to these questions through elaborate mythology, sophisticated theology, and practical ethics created a religious system that sustained one of history's most successful civilizations. When you see Egyptian religious art in museums, remember that you're looking at humanity's attempt to visualize the divine, to make the sacred visible, and to bridge the gap between human and cosmic consciousness. Egyptian religion minds us that humans are spiritual beings who need more than just material success to thrive. We need meaning, community, moral purpose, and hope for something beyond our brief earthly existence. The gods of ancient Egypt may seem strange to modern eyes, but the human needs they addressed for protection, guidance, meaning, and eternal hope remain as relevant today as they were 5,000 years ago along the banks of the River Nile. And that's the real power of Egyptian religion. It shows us that the human search for the divine is one of our most persistent and noble characteristics, driving us to create art, to build communities, to develop ethics, and reach for something greater than ourselves. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.